Chapter 18, Section 2 talks about some of the environmental factors. These would be both biotic, which are living, and abiotic, which are non-living, such as temperature, humidity, pH, sunlight, oxygen. And those factors are not independent of one another. They are related. For instance, the availability of nitrogen in the soil is going to affect how fast plants can grow. And then plants will affect how much nitrogen is available by absorbing certain amounts of it through their root systems. So those factors are related to each other. And then a habitat is just where an organism lives. A tolerance curve refers to what types of environments that an organism can live in to its best potential. So it's a graph that plots performance versus some sort of environmental variable, for instance, temperature. So it's going to have this bell-shaped curve to it. And the middle portion is going to be the optimum range. So for instance, if we were measuring temperature versus swim speed here of fish, well, in kind of medium water temperature, the fish would have the highest swim speed possible. That would be their optimum range. Then kind of in this greenish color here, a little bit further out, would be the area where the organism would be stressed. So they could survive, but it wouldn't be as ideal for them. So too cold temperatures or getting too warm. And then this area farthest out on the sides of the curves are going to be the areas where that organism cannot tolerate those conditions anymore. So that would be intolerable. It's just too cold or too hot, and that fish is not going to be able to swim very well at all, if it can even survive. So that's what a tolerance curve will show us: the optimum conditions for an organism, the areas where they're stressed, and then the conditions where they can't live outside of. Some terms that people tend to interchange sometimes are acclimation and adaptation. When we're talking about acclimations, that's when an individual organism can adjust their tolerance to certain abiotic factors. So for instance, adjusting to a higher elevation. You know, if we try to work out here as compared to going and then working out in Denver, we're going to have a harder time working out in Denver. We're not going to be as used to that higher elevation. There's a difference in air pressure, and we're not able to take in as much oxygen because of that. So we're going to feel more winded than we would here at home. But if we stayed there for a while and continued to work on it, we would be able to adjust our tolerance and acclimate to that area. So that is something that can occur within an organism's lifetime. Adaptation refers to an actual genetic change that occurs over many generations. So this is something that would have to be passed down throughout the generations, as opposed to something that happens within one individual's lifetime. Controlling some of these internal conditions is important for an organism, and an organism can then be either classified as a conformer or a regulator. A conformer would be an organism that does not regulate their internal conditions, so they change as their environment changes. For instance, lizard body temperature. You know, the temperature outside gets warmer, the lizard's body's going to get warmer. With a regulator, they are organisms that are going to use energy to control some of their internal conditions or maintain their homeostasis. So that would be like human body temperature. You know, we're going to shiver when we get cold to try to speed up our metabolism and warm up, and we're going to sweat when we get too hot, so that when the sweat evaporates off our skin, it'll help to cool us down. But we're putting forth energy to control those conditions and try to maintain that stable internal body temperature. Organisms can be both for different situations. For instance, fish can be conformer of body temperatures, but regulators for salt concentration. So depending on the situation and which factor you're looking at, an organism could possibly be both a conformer and a regulator. Sometimes conditions are just too bad for an organism to survive under, and so there are some ways that they could escape from those unsuitable conditions. One of those ways would be through dormancy, which is reduced activity, such as reptiles or amphibians hiding or burrowing underground in the winter when it's cold. probably one that you've heard of is hibernation, when organisms basically go to sleep for the winter. They slow down, they don't do as much activity, so that's a form of dormancy. Or organisms could migrate and they could move to a more favorable habitat. So, for instance, the seasonal movement of birds, that when you see the birds flying south, they're going to warmer climates, and then when it gets nicer up north, then they'll come back home. Resources are all the energy and materials that a species needs to survive. So they could be food, energy, nesting sites, water, sunlight, anything that an organism could need to survive. And then a niche is an organism's way of life, or the role it plays in the environment. And there's two different types: a fundamental niche, which is all the possible conditions a species can tolerate and resources it can use. And then there's the actual realized niche, which is the range of resources that it actually uses. So the realized niche is generally much smaller than the fundamental niche. Organisms have to also take into account, competition for food and space, or avoiding predators. So they might not necessarily use all the possible conditions that it possibly could. Instead, it'll stay in more of a localized area. Even humans, we think of, we could eat pretty much anything, live pretty much anywhere, but, we're most likely going to stay within our, town to eat our meals, or, stay in the local areas to get all of our resources from, as opposed to going across the world to, get dinner. And then niche differences, you can be either a generalist or a specialist. A generalist is a species that has a very broad niche, so they could live lots of places, eat lots of things. Possums and rats would be examples. Specialists would be organisms that have a very narrow niche, so there's limited places they can live and limited things that they can eat. For instance, the koala, they feed on only a few species of leaves from eucalyptus trees, and those eucalyptus trees can only grow in certain locations, so they are considered to be a specialist.